So the title of the show, I think that maybe that's a good place to start the discussion. The title is Keep It Simple, Stupid. And this is something that we could perhaps call it a personal mantra that you recite to yourself. Could you maybe just expand a bit on where it comes from and how you apply it to making paintings in the studio? What happens in the studio? Why is it important to keep it simple?
Well, stupid is one of the least offensive things I call myself when I'm painting, but it's actually a design mantra, and it essentially means keep your ego out of the process, get on with the job in hand. The job in hand is to make a painting, so just make a painting. Painting is very complicated, so again, don't overcomplicate the process. And someone wrote to me about the title, saying he was confused. Did I mean simple in imagery? Did I mean simple in technique? Or was it a double bluff because it wasn't simple at all? So I said all three, because doing whatever it takes to make the painting is very important. And I think a lot of the time you're having to negotiate with yourself, with the material, with the painting itself, and then how the painting is going to be interpreted. And somehow all of those have to lock together.
But you also, I think what's quite common for your way of working is that you make lots of studies beforehand. I don't know whether you call them studies or preparatory works or drawings, sketches, but you talk about, you find an image, or perhaps you generate an image, and then you have to put it through a particular kind of working out before it then gets to the point that you're ready to then translate it or transcribe it into a painting. Is that typical of the work that we see here?
I think it is very typical. So I almost invariably begin by doodling in a sketchbook, partly to kind of get myself into the right kind of mental configuration, but also it's a way of trawling my unconscious, which it's a kind of murky place. I'm never quite sure what's going to come up. But then if an image or a form or something holds my attention, I'll test it out with drawings, and then if it still holds my attention, I'll turn it into a painting. And that's really where the jump in intensity and interest really happens. So may I point to a painting? So if I point to this painting, this is a fairly good example. So it shows two figures. They're kind of ciphers for figures. It's called Diagram for Lovers, and I've reduced the essential bits, the heads, the hearts, and the genitals, to even simpler shapes. And then to make it absolutely clear, I've joined those shapes up with a yellow line, so you know which bits need to connect. But then, if you look a little closer at the image, you see that the surface has been scrawled on, and so suddenly the diagrammatic nature of it is a little bit at odds with the feeling for touch. And then the figure on the right, you sense the kind of pink coming through the white. Again, that's a kind of sensory experience at odds with the cipher-like nature of the figures. And then the figure on the left has these kind of dotted stab marks, which are the equivalents of maybe buttons or costuming, which end in the sort of mark for the eye, which again suggests a kind of self-awareness. So although the image has begun as something quite simple and reduced, it sort of evolves slowly into something a little more complex. But I can't always anticipate how that translation is going to go. Sometimes I have to work it out on the surface quite a lot, as I did with this one, and sometimes it's much more fluent. If I'm really lucky, I can get from the drawing into the painting in 1 or 2 steps, and that, that's ideal. That's kind of brilliant.
So just sticking with that, you mentioned surface, and the surface of this painting is very different to, say, the surface of this painting here, and the one behind you. I think with these two, you're reusing existing paintings as a ground. Yeah. So there's something already there that you're then projecting something else onto. And for example, with this one, you are using the colour underneath to create the edge, the outline. And the surface is a lot heavier and kind of richer in texture. And then with something like this, what we're seeing is the paint's much thinner. We can even kind of see pencil or charcoal, the drawing that's underneath. What is that a conscious decision on your part to reuse older paintings, or when you have to then get a new canvas for the first time? How do you engage with the process of painting when you already have something down there, a painting that perhaps has already been finished and maybe even shown, as opposed to having this white, untouched surface? Do you have to approach it in quite a different way?
There are a number of reasons for that. Often I find I'm so desperate to make a new painting that I will kind of go through old paintings and see if there's anything that I think isn't quite right or doesn't quite work, and then I will just sand it down and put a new painting on top of it. But 3 or 4 years ago, at the start of lockdown, I didn't have any new canvases in the studio, and I couldn't get hold of any. So I literally just thought, all right, work with what you've got, and I did sand things down. Then when I ran out of old canvases, I kind of quite enjoyed the process of having a surface. Then I had to order in new canvases, then I had to kind of start fresh. So what I do is I buy really expensive fine French linen, single oil primed, and then I immediately reprime it with some rubbish, just to kind of give me a sort of a kind of offset against which I can work. It's interesting because the surface is obviously key. It's key to how the image evolves, how the image is understood. In this painting, there are so many paintings underneath it that I couldn't, in fact, sand it down entirely, and you see quite a lot of history. They're not pentimenti in the sense they're not changes of mind, there's some other thing. And in this instance, I quite like it. It kind of it creates a surface which I enjoy, which I think sets up a kind of friction with the image itself. In a painting like that, where there's none of that prehistory, then I enjoyed something more about the immediacy of the paint going on, the fact that the single first line can carry enough weight in itself.
So there you mentioned that you reprime the canvases that you have with whatever crappy primer you use. And that kind of connects to something that you've said in the past about where you try to avoid being seduced by the paint, by the viscosity or the malleability or whatever it is. Could you say maybe something about that, why you think that's important for you? And if you're trying to avoid being seduced by the paint, are you happier to be seduced by the image? That's quite that's a multi-part question.
The short answer is I don't know. I mean, I think everybody paints in their own way. Everybody has a different approach. For me, I like to get somewhere very immediately. And if I find I'm being distracted by the richness of the medium, then it's usually not allowing me to get there very directly. And paint, for me, paint is so full of possibility. I think that's the real danger. There's always another route you can take. So each route opens up another set of possibilities. Each of those possibilities open up yet more possibilities. And then you can just circle yourself endlessly. So again, it's just about being as direct as possible.
Because these are all oil, but you have gone through periods where you've used acrylic on paper.
Yeah. Well, I use the word oil in an expanded sense, because I use quite a lot of oil-based enamel kind of fairly industrial householdy paints, which I then mix with really expensive proper oil paint. Whatever works, essentially, that's whatever works.
For people who, I'm sure everyone in the audience is familiar with your work. When I first asked you to, if you'd be interested in doing a show here, I was quite open in terms of what the show could be, whether it was going to be a mixture of all the different types of paintings that you've made, whether it was going to be from a particular period, whether it was new work mixed with old work. When I think of your paintings, I think of this fracturing, this kaleidoscopic colouring, where the figure and ground are much more kind of integrated into each other. Perhaps a much more spatially complex. I'm thinking of the paintings from maybe the mid-2000s. So I think that for some people this might mark a bit of a departure in terms of what they think of as being your work. It's still very much, it has that consistent Ansel Krut-ness to it. But maybe you could say something about what prompted the change in the palette in particular. Because I know at one point you started to just use, I suppose, this painting is quite a good example where the colour was used very, very sparingly. And it seems like you're maybe reintroducing it now back in, but in a different way.
Again, that was something that began in a fairly happenstance way with the start of COVID, when I had few materials but a lot of black in the studio and a lot of old paintings to cover. So I started to work with fairly heavy blacks, and then it really did change how I understood colour in a way that I haven't quite processed yet. Something to do with thinking more tonally rather than in pure hue. Am I allowed an anecdote?
We welcome anecdotes.
We welcome anecdotes. So when I was a student at the Royal College, a tutor of mine organised the Picasso Matisse show. This must have been in '85. And he was a man I was totally in awe of, John Golding. And when I went to the exhibition, I saw him there. He was talking to a very stern woman. I couldn't help myself. I sort of ran up to him and I said, "John, the blacks are incredible." And then this rather stern woman turned to me and said, "Actually, it's the greys." And John said, "Ansel, have you met Bridget Riley?" And it's taken me 40 years to understand what she's meant. That working in the tonal range through the greys actually opens up a different set of possibilities, particularly through how you work with light and space.
Well, it's interesting that you mention light, because there's something about these paintings to me that feels very underground, very subterranean, almost a world without light or without a light source.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's an observation. I would say it's a good thing, I think. I think it adds something to the paintings.
I was reading a book recently called Light in Early Italian Painting, where he tries to work out the shift that happens between Byzantine and Renaissance painting. And he talks about you observe the effects of light and cast shadow. We all do that. It's not a scientific new discovery. I don't think it was ever a new discovery, but philosophically, the shift that painters had to make between using with a kind of conceptual understanding of light in the painting and an observed understanding. When you see light, it models form, but also gives you a sense of space into perspective. Now, I don't model form, and there's no real sense of space into perspective. So I think I probably have a Byzantine imagination. I think, or at least that's what feels close to me at the moment. That's what seems to make sense at the moment.
Yeah, because there is something that's not collaged about them, but I feel as if the figures, the personages, however you want to describe them, have this paper-thin quality to them. They're not modelled in that sense. They don't have weight or mass, but they still have, I suppose, shape is kind of their defining characteristic. But then you do, I'm sure when I've been to your studio, I've seen you stick bits of paper onto the canvas as a way of trialling things or seeing possibilities.
Well, I mean, there's a very clear example in that painting over there where you see the dark shape in the figure on the right. And I knew I needed something dark there to hold your attention. So I have lots of bits of paper in my studio, and I found this piece of black paper, and I thought, oh, that might work. And I stuck it on, and it was kind of perfect. So I thought, well, I'll just use that shape. I did not cut that out. It pre-existed. And for me, that's really quite an important thing, the idea of something that already exists. In a weird sort of way, it's a sort of reversal of the painting under paintings. The painting under paintings already exist. It gives a different sense of reality to what happens next. So with the collage, it was a bit like, oh, I found this, I'll stick it on there. It's attached to the world in a slightly different way. Now it has to find a place in the painting. In that instance, I was a little concerned because it sort of introduced a narrative element I wasn't entirely sure about. And it reminded me a little bit of that rather wonderful Watteau in the Wallace collection. But then, so I was stuck in this peculiar position of thinking, is it okay for me to introduce a narrative element because there's a formal need for that dark shape there? And then Scott was coming to choose paintings the next day, and I thought, I want this one to be in the show, so I painted it in. So you're responsible.
It's here. So you mentioned there the narrative element. When you're painting or after you finished painting, do you think about potential narratives? Do you think about what other people, the narratives that they might project onto the paintings? Because I think maybe says something along the lines in the press release of, we're looking at something that has never existed before. It still feels familiar to us. So for example, the duck and the plane, there are these two things that are very kind of commonplace that we see every day. But then you're presenting it in a way that we've never seen it before. So there's this idea of something that is it's the everyday with something that's much more kind of absurd. There's also this idea of the archaic with the embryonic. Are these kind of things that you think about, or is that just naturally how the work develops? Because as you say, it really starts from doodling.
Yeah. I try not to articulate anything until the painting is pretty much done, because then it tends to, if I find I'm talking about the painting too soon, it's usually because I need to kind of find excuses for it. So often when the painting is finished, then I'm prepared to explain it to myself, and I'm prepared to kind of find a rationale. So in the duck plane image, I could explain it now, but when I was making the painting, it just, I don't know how, felt right, in inverted commas. I came up with an image. I thought there's something about this that that I can intuitively sense will work as a painting. And now I look at it, and then I can find all sorts of reasons for me having made it. I think that those reasons are fairly consistent throughout all the images, about a sense of logic stretched to snapping point, really. So it's very important for me that you believe in the images somehow, even though they are unbelievable. I think particularly with the duck plane, I kind of felt it's a little bit like an image that you might have found on a medieval map. You know, this is something you might find at the end of the world. Or, you know, like Dürer's rhinoceros, it's been reported, and then I'm working from the reported. It's still real, but it's not something that...
It's like a translation of a translation of something that, gets more, The motif of the plane reappears a few times in the exhibition, and also in other paintings. Is there something there? I mean, for me, it kind of points to this idea of an escape, of trying to go somewhere else, almost as if the forms, the things don't want to be in the painting, and they're trying to escape to somewhere else. There's this urge to move beyond what we see.
Not consciously. No, not consciously. I think there is a sense of that in a slightly different way, in that some of the figures look as if they don't quite fit onto the format, or they're trying to come out of the format. They're trying to escape their limitations. It might well be that if I ever go into analysis, the plane might emerge as a thing. But not really. So a painting like that, for instance, which is called Three Celebrated Aviators, has a plane in it, but it's not really for me about the idea of flying. It's much more the idea of kind of cultural mix-up. And in the way I've painted it, the way I've painted it is reminiscent for me a little bit of, you know, it's hieratic. It might look like something from a Soviet medal, or beyond a mural in Latin America, celebrating kind of forgotten heroes. So, you know, again, it's that sense of this disjointedness which makes sense to me in the paintings, because to some extent it reflects a little bit of how I kind of see the world. After I finished that painting and I began this sort of post-painting rationalization, I thought, oh, this reminds me of when I was on the beach in Sperlonga, which is a small town outside Rome, and Sperlonga, has a kind of a history that goes back to ancient Rome, because Tiberius had a villa there. The beach is very flat, so it's a good place to land an invading army, which the Americans did in the war, so there was that kind of history. So I was there with my kids on the beach with this kind of sense of dual history, and then a plane flew past, trailing a banner that said, Bob Dylan plays Sperlonga. And I thought, that is really weird. I mean, that sense of displacement, the double history is my being there with my children, then Bob Dylan turning up. And in a way, that kind of mood of surprised alertness to being in a place was kind of what I think the painting in the end was touching on. But again, I only thought all those complex thoughts after the painting had been made. In the painting I've tried to build in some of that sense of, well, I think of that painting really as a kind of mock heroic painting. So there are these figures who kind of must have been celebrities at one time, but are now forgotten, and the lines leading up to the plane are kind of diminishing. So their sense of status is diminished up to the object that made them celebrities in the first place.
But they're also they look as if they're the same person. They have no kind of singular identity. They're kind of replication of each other.
Yeah, reduced. Yeah. They're very reduced. They're reduced to ciphers in a way.
And how do you, because I know that when we put the show together, that was not one of your favourite paintings. Have you changed your mind now that you see it in the show?
No. The weird thing, and I've changed my mind about most of these paintings, not always for the best. But it's a very peculiar thing, the way you feel about a painting. Each time you make a painting, you think that, and if it works, it's great. Everything becomes focused on that until the next painting. I don't know. I'm really probably the worst judge of my own work.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
So you said that you're not, when you're painting, you're not thinking necessarily about the painting in descriptive terms or narrative terms. What do you do as you're painting? Do you listen to music? Is it complete silence? Do you have short bursts of activity? It's a hard question because I'm sure that you do lots of different things. No, you don't.
No. I do exactly the same thing. I was on a panel last night with some other artists, and they were talking about how you get into the zone for making a painting. And one of them said, they have TV programs on loop, like Succession or something. And they need that distraction in order to make the painting. And I literally couldn't get my head around it. I like silence. I mean, I don't want music, I don't want other voices. There's enough noise in my head already without anything else being there. So it really is about getting into that place where you sort of allow things to happen. And I go to my studio, I often just sit and wait. Kafka said of writing, you just sit at your desk and wait and the world will come and roll at your feet like a dog. It doesn't quite happen like that for me, but there is a moment where I can see, literally, things come into focus. I was painting the other day and I was desperate to paint and things weren't in focus, but I thought, oh, they will come into focus as I paint, and they didn't. And I think I messed something up. It's not irretrievable, but I didn't kind of get where I needed to go, simply because when I find when I'm painting, then I'm not consciously making decisions. My hand goes to a color, or I mix certain colors, and it just kind of works. Or even if I get it wrong, I know how to correct it. But if I'm fighting that lack of clarity all the time, no, it's not going to work.
But I suppose with the way that you're working, some decisions have already been made through the preparatory work. But then, as you say, when you actually come to the moment of making the painting, there are enough things to be thinking about, enough challenges, even when you're coming with this.
Well, that's the key moment, isn't it? Because somehow you have to get from the study. You know, even if I make a color study, then I think all I have to do in the painting is translate it as directly as possible. But that's not going to happen because the format might be slightly different, or you're scaling up, or the material brings its own baggage. So you have to negotiate with your paint. You have to kind of say, all right, what happens if I use a slightly denser paint? It's going to slow down the mark, you know, and that's going to change the meaning, that's going to inflect the meaning. So there's almost too much to think about. So I find I have to kind of throw myself into it and just trust that somehow instinct or experience or luck will allow me to make the relevant choice.
And when it gets to a point where I think you used the phrase locking things in, or something locks into place earlier. So when that happens, is that when you start to slow down, or is that when you start to speed up? Is that when because the other thing that is that this exhibition does not perhaps illustrate is that when you show your paintings, you prefer to have them framed. So the painting behind me is framed, but the rest are not, which I know was quite a difficult thing for you to overcome in terms of this being kind of the last outline is very important in the paintings anyway, but it's almost as if you're then outlining the edges themselves when you put a frame on them, as if that's the last act that has to be carried out before the painting becomes finished or complete or whatever.
Well, I think it's partly because once a frame goes on, it's less mine. It's a bit, then I can project it into another space, and then I can sort of judge it slightly more objectively. And I used to feel also then I wouldn't be able to go back into it because it's now complete. But that's not true. If they come back to my studio, I take them out of the frames. But the frame also reminds me, I'm very aware of the edge of the canvas, and I know there are lots of people who work with unstretched canvas. You know, they draw shape. Guston did it, Bonnard did it, lots of people here do it. And it gives you a lot of flexibility, because then when you stretch the painting up, you can make adjustments. But somehow for me, in my sort of mental universe, I need that edge. So when I draw, I almost invariably draw the edge around the image, and the approach to edge or the movement over edge or something somehow resonates in an important way for me. And then the frame itself reinforces that. It's like it's a conceptual constraint which I need to have there in some way. We were talking about, painting, the idea of perspectival space, whatever my paintings don't have, looking, the idea of paint, you look through a window in order to see a painting. Maybe the frame is my compensation for it not being a window. I don't know, that's something in it is important for me. Or maybe it just looks posher, it's kind of, I don't know. Looks like art. It looks like art. When it's got a frame on it, looks like art.
So, are any of your paintings ever safe when they're in the studio? Because it seems even if when they have been shown and they come back, they've got a frame on them, you're still willing to go back in. Is there anything that would make you not do that? Because it reminds me of something that Charlene von Heil said, where she described paintings as survivors. So it's this kind of idea of, but it seems to me as if you kind of almost have nothing survives potentially. These paintings here that we see, some of them may end up looking completely different.
I presume they are. I mean, there's some I'm more reluctant to paint over. Okay. I don't know. There's a painting I've been working on since 2019, and I keep thinking it's finished, and it was framed, and it's been photographed many times, but I keep coming back to it, thinking it's not quite right. I can always make it better.
And make it worse.
I have actually made it worse.
Yeah, okay.
Made it worse. Yeah. That's the risk.
I think we all know. That feeling quite well. I'm just aware of the time. I've got more things that I could kind of talk about. There was this phrase, a delinquent painting, that came into my head. As if I think of these as being quite delinquent paintings, they're not really doing what you want them to. I don't know why I think of that. They're not really kind of there's something about them that they're not really behaving in the way I hope that they do, or they're doing something that kind of bothers me, but it's through the bothering that makes them interesting. That's maybe, again, perhaps not a question that you can respond to.
I think it's a very astute question, actually. It's kind of, it goes into quite uncomfortable territory. And in a way, it kind of goes right back to the idea of me getting a really expensive surface and then messing it up. That's just a stupid and delinquent thing to do, but somehow it feels necessary in some cases. And in the same way that I use enamels, which are not oil paints, again, because it's slightly improper. It shouldn't be, but it can be. I think, no, I have no idea. There's a germ of something in there that feels very true. I can't quite articulate what it is.
Do you think your younger self would be surprised that these are the paintings you're now making?
Which younger self?
Say the Ansel Krut who just left the RCA, or the Ansel Krut, who was in Rome. Because if I think back to your earlier work from the 90s, the figurative painting, on the one hand, you could say there are these quite vast differences, but at the same time, there are probably quite a lot of similarities that the paintings share?
Well, the delinquency was always there. I mean, that's been the constant. I mean, I reviewed my work from the last 20 years, and there is a kind of thread. So the period you're talking about is when I was trying to paint a little more academically. And that's a lot to do with me feeling, having grown up where I did in South Africa and then coming to Europe and then being exposed to, in a much more immediate and direct way, to the sort of the mastery of European art, feeling I had to learn that. And then I think when I got to 40, I thought, I'm never going to get anywhere with this. And I sort of switched to working in a more immediate way. And it was to do with having children as well, suddenly seeing the world afresh through the intensity of a child's gaze. And I don't know what motivates anybody to paint, but I just happened to be reading yesterday Norman Mailer, and he said, the artist is the product of the child, even though the art is nothing to do with the child, they are the product of the child. He was talking about Muhammad Ali, but the point is the same, that we can't escape ourselves in some way. And in a weird sort of way, you have to, oh God, this is going to sound like a healthfulness seminar. You have to kind of get back to something that's essential to you. And that's not what the paintings are about, but it has to be meaningful to you in some way. I was not a delinquent child.
You were not?
No, I was not. I was very well behaved. I didn't fit in, but I wasn't delinquent.
Because you started off studying medicine for 2 years before you then decided to become a painter. Yeah. But I presume that before that you still wanted to be a painter.
Yeah, there was family history around being going into medicine, and also immigrant families needing to have, professional status and so on. I hated it. I managed to do 2 years. In the second year, you did dissection. And I remember, that was awful. Anyway, 5 very anxious teenagers gathered around a cadaver, and then you open the book, first day of anatomy, and it says, examine the structure of the external ear. And the 5 of us were sort of looking, this is the lobe. And then the professor who was running it said, forget that, people, cut. And kind of what he was saying was, get to the essentials, don't mess about. Detail is important, but there's too much to be getting on with. Just go straight in. Of course, we were horrified. 2 weeks later, we were all eating our lunch around it was fine, but that first incision was very difficult. I don't know why my mind now jumps to this, but I happened to be reading yesterday as well about the mindset Matisse had when he started a painting. And he said starting a painting is like having to kick a door down or cutting open an abscess with a penknife. Matisse, sort of rotund little middle-class man, all that thing about the urgency of painting, somehow that remains very important to me, and that ties into the keep it simple, stupid, getting there very directly.
Starting a painting is the worst for me. That's the worst part of painting is starting. I much prefer the other end where...
Do you do the preparatory work there?
Sometimes it's that thing. Some paintings come from that, others just materialize almost out of the ether. I don't even know where they come from, possibly other paintings.
I mean, given that everybody can paint, children can paint, elephants can paint, do you think we make it more difficult for ourselves?
Do we make it more difficult for ourselves? Yeah. I think we probably make lots of things more difficult for ourselves. Yeah. Painting is one of them.
I sometimes think that artists generally are painters are just slightly better organized. So they sort of develop a structure that allows them to paint without killing them. They have almost like a system. If you look at someone like Charlene von Hale, for example, she's a proposition A, proposition B. How do these two things work together? Do they reinforce each other, contradict each other, and so on? Brilliant system. You can become very complex from that, but you need that starting point. I envy people who kind of go into painting and sort of throw themselves into it and then allow the paint to kind of grow out of that. I can't do it.
Well, it's a very difficult thing because it's a state of mind or a particular state of alertness, and to have the perception to be able to realise what's happening and seize upon that. And I think that, yeah, if you're making big gestural actions when you're painting that are very quick, for me, the act of painting, the process of painting has to come from this much slower pace of realization, because I'm usually not that alert most of the time. Certainly when I'm painting, I'm probably not. So for me, it's very much I am, in much the same way that you describe, doing something just almost to do it because I have to do it, not because I think that it's the right thing to do or even the best thing to do, but I have to do something, so I may as well do that.
But this hyper alertness you describe, how are you thinking? Are you thinking verbally, conceptually, or are you thinking with that part of your brain that is relying on visual input? I mean, do you say to yourself, all right, now I need to do this, I need to articulate the space, or I need to introduce an element of line or contrast? Or are you trusting to that bit of processing where things are making sense? You know they're making sense, but you're not quite articulating them.
The latter, I would say. Something's happening that I can't necessarily describe or assign language to. So it's very difficult to talk, especially when it is a painting that is there being made at that moment. It's a lot easier to talk about paintings from 4 years ago or 5 years ago, when a painting is still in the studio and it's next to other paintings. I suppose maybe that's something that's what I do, is I put paintings next to each other, and it's through comparisons between the paintings that I feel makes things slightly easier on myself, as opposed to looking at a painting on its own as this autonomous entity. Again, it's easier to do that once the painting's been in existence for a while. But if I've just put down the brush and I'm looking at it, I find that it's actually easier to see it in relation to other paintings than see it on its own.
But there's still a kind of decision making, isn't there, where you say to yourself, I need to choose a brush. And then you sort of know whether you're going to go for a round or a filbert or a flat. And that you don't think to yourself, maybe you do. You just sort of know. in the same way that you know that at this point you need to apply a certain kind of pressure, that if you press a little bit harder, somehow that pressure is going to get into the painting, and not only that, somebody looking at the painting, without thinking about it, will understand that that's a pressured mark. So there's that sort of mirror reaction between what you're doing, what you're expecting to be understood. And for myself, I can't think about it. It's too complicated for me to think about. And often I will almost find myself absent-mindedly picking up a brush and rubbing it on my hand or my cheek, and then think, why am I doing that? And it's me testing the bristle to see how stiff the bristle is, because I know that that will carry a kind of meaning, which then will be understood by the person looking at the painting. So, I mean, that's very complex perceptual, neurological processing.
But then, I mean, I have, say, 40 brushes, and I only probably use 4 or 5 again and again, to the point of...
But they're very specific, aren't they?
They're very specific.
And some of them are worn down in a particular way.
Well, that's even better. Yeah. The more worn down they are, that's somehow...
Yeah, but you know that. I mean, there's that kind of knowledge that you've acquired that will make you go instinctively towards that brush.
Yeah, because I guess the closest thing I can think of to describe it is an informed intuition. You know a little bit because you've done it before, but then you're also not 100% sure what's actually going to happen until you do it. So I suppose, the advice is to keep it simple. Stupid.
Thanks.